very much appreciative of each and every one of you, even some of your superintendents, like Merv Darty from Chesterfield, and Melody, Dr. Melody Acne from Hopewell, have continued these conversations in their communities well after these meetings. And so I really appreciate you sharing with your colleagues and with your superintendents these important conversations. I would also say, educational justice doesn't happen by happenstance. We have to go out and actually move it. That's why educational justice is a movable term and something that I think we can all accomplish in our communities. And I really am appreciate that we have one of our fantastic thought partners with us today, someone that has centered themselves around critical conversations, around critical thought. And that is Dr. Hong. And I think you will really enjoy not only what she has to share, but it will continue the conversations that you are having in your communities. And so I thank and welcome each and every one of you, and I hope you each have a wonderful rest of the day in listening to our friend, Dr. Soo Hong.
Thank you, Dr. Walter. And I'll see if Dr. Norman is online. Is Dr. Norman online? If not, we will move on and he can kind of talk with us a little bit later. I would like to introduce Dr. Hong, and I will share a brief bio about Dr. Hong. And we are so glad she has joined us from Boston. And she said it is not cold this evening. She said it's actually 60 degrees and it feels pretty good. Dr. Soo Hong is a Whitehead Associate Professor of Critical Thought and Associate Professor and Chair of Education at Wellesley College. She's a sociologist of education who studies the relationships between schools and families and communities, exploring the impact of race, culture, social history, and political life. She explores the central roles of families and communities in school transformation through models that emphasize parent leadership, community organizing, and democratic forms of participation. Dr. Hong is the author of the recently published Natural Allies, Hope and Possibility in Teacher-Family Partnerships from Harvard Education Press in 2019, as well as A Cord of Three Strands, A New Approach to Parent Engagement in Schools, Harvard Education Press 2011. She's the co-director of the Project for Public Leadership and Action at Wellesley College. At the center of her research and teaching is a desire to develop action-oriented research that is integrated with practice and grounded in the lived experiences of young people and families in urban schools. So without further ado, we welcome to our virtual stage, Dr. Soo Hong.
Thanks so much for that great introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. I know it's a busy time of the day, so I appreciate you taking the time to be with each other and to connect with me. So, I'm thinking about the many times I've stood in front of educators in a school to give this kind of talk before, and I'm reminded, as we've all been continually reminded over the past year, how precious those in-person meetings and interactions have been. And so I'm appreciative of all the educators who made space to be here today. And I hope that what I share with you today resonates in some way for you. And I want to thank the department for inviting me to be part of this speaker series and this important conversation. And I'm really excited to hear about the ways that you're enacting change in the Commonwealth. So as I begin, first I want to start with a story. And it's a story from my experience as a first-year teacher all the way back in 1996. I was teaching fourth grade and it was October or November. And, at that point, I was familiar with all of the rituals of parent involvement in schools because they were, like for many of us, they were a universal part of my own experience growing up. The parent-teacher conferences, the back-to-school nights, which my parents diligently attended, as well as other things like PTAs and chaperoning on field trips that were, a bit more out of reach for my parents as immigrants. And so, I remember here I was, a first-year teacher, getting ready to enact those experiences myself as a teacher. And I remember being nervous. And so, what do I do when I'm nervous? I get prepared. So I remember sending out sign-up slips to students' families. That's kind of like how long ago I taught, like we used to have like papers that we would send home, and you would write down the time and send it, cut off the bottom and send it back to me. And I remember sending out those slips to students' families so that parents could, or caregivers could, sign up for conference time. And I meticulously organized my classroom. I filled the bulletin boards with student work because I really wanted to impress the families that were coming into my classroom. And then for each student, I also prepared some of their work and some of my own comments so that I could share to the best of my ability about the progress that they had made so far this year. And I had this all planned out, and I remember feeling like I just really wanted to impress them, in part because as a new teacher, I was feeling pretty new and insecure, right? So as the conference day approached, I had a very small number of parents who had actually signed up to attend. And then as the day unfolded, even some of them didn't show up. And so then I went from feeling anxious and nervous about the conversations to this kind of growing disappointment and even a sense of resentment by the end of the day, because I felt like I'd put in all this time to prepare for them, but then had little interest from students' families to reciprocate. And so I remember walking out of the school building that evening, and I was headed to my car in the parking lot. And I remember being steeped in these thoughts of disappointment, and I caught myself. I caught myself because I started to remember all these moments from my own childhood growing up in Baltimore. I was the oldest child in a Korean immigrant family. And I remembered, the time when a teacher told me to read a note she had written to my parents to make sure that I could read it and translate it to them. And this was even though my parents could speak English at the time. And I remember the times my parents would come home from conferences with a lot more questions and confusion than answers. I remember their nervousness around being in the school. And I remember hearing teachers say that we students didn't care, or that our families didn't care enough to show up. And, I had known from the moment that I decided to become a teacher, I decided to become a teacher my sophomore year in college. Like I was volunteering. I went to the University of Virginia, and I was volunteering at a school in Charlottesville. And I was actually studying to be an architect, but volunteering in the classroom with this wonderful teacher who had built these amazing relationships with her students. And that experience really inspired me to go into teaching, because I felt like it was a way that I could really authentically connect with young people, and that like together we could make a difference in the world, right? So, I knew from the moment that I'd become a teacher that those were the kinds of things I didn't want to hear coming out of my mouth, or like even thinking. And so here I was just a few months into my first year of teaching, and I had to catch myself. So what was happening? Well, as I reflect back on that experience, there's so much that I would do differently, especially when it comes to connecting with families. And this is because I kind of bring an equity mindset to this work now. In many ways, family engagement and connecting with families was an afterthought to me. It was never something that anyone in my teacher education program taught me to think about. Even now when I talk to the pre-service teachers who are part of my current research project, they tell me about mentor teachers who forbid them to talk with parents, and also choose not to invite them, say, I don't want you to come to the back to school night, even though it's happening next week, because they don't want questions from the families about who they are and what they're doing. So, these student teachers that I talk to are nervous about connecting with families, and no one's really taught them how. But at the same time, I know that because they tell me they're curious about students' families, and also believe that it's important to know their students holistically. And so this was my experience too. I had this curiosity without knowledge and support. And so in many ways, I think engaging with families became an afterthought to me because it was always unspoken and unaddressed. So then where does that leave us? Well, when we don't support teachers and in engaging families, we're often left with superficial relationships or a lack of engagement and connection. that often will leave us with knowledge gaps and a lack of understanding about the experiences of families. So what the research shows us is that this void or this gap in understanding is not benign. Instead, it can be filled with false perceptions and problematic stereotypes and assumptions about others. This idea that negative stereotypes and assumptions shapes how we perceive the actions of others, we often call this deficit thinking or deficit framing, right? So we let those stereotypes stand in for the lack of information and understanding that we have about communities. And then we begin to believe that those are true. So that's what I was beginning to do in that experience during my first year. I had few connections with families by then, beyond the few that had kind of come in before the start of the year to kind of introduce themselves or kind of, they were curious about who I was. And so when they didn't respond to my invitations, I started to make assumptions about why that was happening. I think this is dangerous. And there are countless ways that deficit views about students and families can have detrimental impacts on students' experiences in schools. So one of the things that we often expect principals to do is to build a positive school climate that shapes the practices that we see in schools, right? And as an ethnographer and a sociologist of education, I would go so far as to say that we're examining the culture of schools. What are the values and beliefs that shape teaching and learning in our schools? What are the values and beliefs that shape the interactions between teachers and students and between educators and families? When we're focused on equity-oriented policies and practices that shape engagement with the community, we have to first turn to the kinds of mindset and values we bring to this work. And more explicitly, it should prompt us to ask the question, what are the values and beliefs we hold about students and their families? When examining those values, it's important to recognize and name when we're guided by deficit views of families. This could be rooted in a lack of knowledge and the experiences that they have, right? It can also be shaped by unexamined perspectives that are influenced by racist, xenophobic, or classist beliefs about communities. And even among educators who deem themselves well-intentioned, we may participate in systems of oppression that have historically marginalized BIPOC students and families. So for example, we might use terms and language to describe students, such as at risk, or they're disadvantaged, non-readers, or even describe students who attend failing schools. So this is language that continues to perpetuate harmful and shallow misrepresentations of students. It's also important to acknowledge that there's a mismatch in our country between who teaches and who learns. The teaching profession is largely white, female, and monolingual. Principals, especially, are largely white, male, and monolingual. Our schools and classrooms, on the other hand, have become increasingly diverse, racially, linguistically, culturally, ethnically. I don't say this to assume that white educators and principals can't be effective advocates of BIPOC students, but I can say with certainty that we have to support educators and school leaders in learning how to respond to the social and cultural lives of their students and to recognize the full range of community cultural wealth that they bring to our school communities. So clearly, there have been developments in moving beyond deficit thinking. We have the rich history and beautiful legacy of scholars like Gloria Ladson-Billings, Lisa Delpit, and more recently, scholars like Django Paris, Sami Alim, Bettina Love, and Goldie Muhammad. They've created space for us to think about what we might call asset-based pedagogies. And the asset-based frameworks of culturally responsive and culturally sustaining education, they celebrate the cultural and lived experiences of students and work to incorporate our knowledge of students' culture and community into the classroom and into the curriculum. However, when we talk about culturally responsive and sustaining education through this equity perspective, we usually focus on the importance of having students' family stories and their community represented in our curriculum. We want students to see their lives in the curriculum. It may be in the text that they read, in the way that we engage with their communities. We've even come to the recognition that we should learn about their families. So for example, in Goldie Muhammad's book, Cultivating Genius, an Equity Framework for Culturally and Historically Responsive Literature or Literacy, which is a wonderful book, she explains in a section there that teachers should interview parents or family members of students who are culturally different from them as part of a set of practices that allow them to learn and understand the histories, identities, and literacies of students, right? But while I think that is a wonderful idea, I think we should have a larger purpose than enhancements to the curriculum. I think we have to set the bar higher. Our engagement with families shouldn't really just merely be about bringing more knowledge and representation into the classroom or kind of bringing that knowledge into our own awareness. I think it has to be rooted in a desire to be in constant and evolving, authentic relationships with students' families. So this would represent a cultural shift or set a positive tone for a school's willingness to work with families and for that engagement with families and communities to be embedded in the very climate and culture of the school. So while I enthusiastically agree that we need to incorporate family histories and experiences into the realm of knowledge of our educators and principals, in some ways it seems that we have to have that larger purpose, right? So a big question for us then is, how do we take it one step further and build a relational approach to family engagement? And how does our efforts to build culturally responsive and sustaining models of education integrate those relationships that we build with families? So, back to that story, when I think back on those early years as a teacher, I'm surprised by how much I felt that the interactions with families had to be driven by me, the teacher. As a new teacher, I felt like it was my job to tell parents what I saw and to explain what I know and show them my expertise. So many of those early, family conferences that I had, short as they often were, they were, I'm embarrassed to admit, but they are primarily one-way conversations that were directed by me. Let me tell you what I see in the classroom. Here's how your child is reading. Here's what I see socially. This is what she's good at. Here's what I'd like her to work on. Like that was kind of, the overarching message of the conversation, and it was directed by me. It took me many years, as well as just a whole different mindset altogether, to realize that those conversations should actually be a conversation, a two-way dialogue. And if anyone should be doing most of the talking in October about these young people, it should be the parent or the caregiver telling me about the many things that they know about their child and the unique and multifaceted perspectives that they have as the child's very first teacher, right? So one question we can be asking ourselves as we think about the example of these conferences that are part of most school experiences is, whose voice dominates during those conversations? Who's listening and why? Who's doing the talking and why? This is the focus of my talk tonight. We all know what family engagement looks like, but we usually focus on the rituals and activities, and we don't always focus on the relationships and the work that goes into building them. So over my years as an educator, as a researcher, and even as a parent to a 6th grader and a 10th grader, I've come to realize that this is something that we can always bring to the table when we want to think about improving relationships between families and schools. How can we have a relational approach to family engagement in schools? So it's not just about like turning up numbers and attendance, but it's about building these authentic relationships. So while we can acknowledge that schools and classrooms, as well as the local communities that they serve, can be diverse and changing, our conception about what parent involvement looks like can actually be quite universal and lack creativity. The research into family engagement confirms this for us. And if I were to ask you, or new teachers or grandparents, even young people, the question, what does family involvement look like in schools? I think I would probably get some pretty similar answers. So, what would people tell me? Probably they talk about parent-teacher conferences, chaperones at field trips, PTAs or PTOs, bake sales, fundraisers. We might also hear people talk about back to school nights and open houses and maybe workshops for families, right? So what are some of the things that we notice about those activities besides the fact that they're pretty universal? Well, when we look at the efforts that are parent initiated, right, like the bake sales and the PTOs and the fundraisers and the chaperoning, these are ways that families in a school community band together to show their love and support for the school. Parent associations might raise funds to allow the school to provide resources for projects that are outside of their limited operating budget, maybe. Or, they might host a breakfast to show appreciation to teachers at the end of the year. So families show that they care and want to support the school, even outside of the experience of their own child, right? Because these are, the things we talked about, they're usually collective efforts. When we look at the activities that are initiated by schools, right, on the other hand, such as parent-teacher conferences, open houses, or parent workshops, we see that these efforts are often guided by a desire to bring parents and caregivers into the school, to give them a sense of the teachers, the curriculum, the classrooms, and the school spaces that shape their child's experience. It's also an opportunity to support the individual child, their academic learning and development, and to get teachers and family members on the same page about how to best support them. So we should continue to support these kinds of efforts. When I say that they're universal, I don't mean that they're causing harm or they're lacking. But one question we can be asking ourselves when we're thinking about educational equity and this idea that we want to reach all families, are these events and activities providing space for parents and educators to get to know each other and build authentic relationships with one another? If we go back to my experience as a new teacher, I was explaining a situation to you where I was participating in a very common ritual, the parent-teacher conference. And to that ritual, I was applying my own judgment and values on the purpose of that interaction. It was basically for me to relay information to a student's family and get them to support my goals as the child's teacher. Was I seeking to build a relationship with this family? If you asked me that question, I would certainly say yes. But do we really call something a relationship if the communication is one way and all the decisions are made by one of the actors in that relationship? I'd have to tell my younger self, no. So in research, we can call these transactional relationships. So inherent in the relationship or connection is this understanding that you'll get something out of it. In my case, as a teacher, I get to communicate what I saw in the classroom and hopefully get parents' support and agreement on a plan of action. But the children who are at the heart of every parent-teacher relationship, we know, because many of you are probably parents yourselves, are precious, loved, cherished human beings in their family. So even though teachers and family members too may want something accomplished out of these interactions, what families often want is an authentic relationship where teachers and caregivers learn to connect with each other, trust each other, because they have a shared interest in having the child grow, flourish, and thrive. So here's what one of the parents in my research study told me about the kinds of relationships that she said she wants with her child's teacher. She says, I want to feel seen and understood. And I want to feel that there's a curiosity about the knowledge and insight I have on my child. This is not because I want to feel important or recognized, but because if you communicate or show that kind of interest in me as the parent, it communicates to me that you want to work with me and that getting to know me and my family is an important part of your work as a teacher who's supporting my child. So then how can we reimagine the interactions between families and schools through the lens of authentic relationships between teachers and families? Principals set the tone and vision for this stance towards families. and they create a climate and culture in which families are seen as partners in supporting the academic, social, emotional development of students. That means that a school's approach to engaging families and communities can't rest on the development of programs and activities alone. So the familiar practices of parent-teacher conferences, family nights, and back-to-school programs should certainly continue, with principals setting high expectations for creating welcoming and inviting spaces that encourage all parents to participate fully. But they can also teach us to think about our work with families more fully. So developing a stance where families and communities are seen as valuable partners. So I have some questions that could be useful when we guide educators to build this kind of positive, equity-based school climate that supports family and community engagement and, family engagement for all families. So I'm going to walk you through some of the questions that you could ask. So the first question is, do the conversations between families and educators reflect two-way communication? In conferences, in back-to-school nights, in phone calls with teachers, are these conversations designed to invite a family member's perspective and share their experience, even in ways that might express their disagreement or maybe their different way of seeing the situation, right? Another question we can ask is, are there supports in place to make these conversations easier for families when there are distinct challenges that they may face? So you think back on my experience, I had very few parents and caregivers show up for that first year, the round of parent-teacher conferences that I did. And one of my failures was I didn't think about why. I started to assume why, but I didn't think to understand what could be making it challenging for them to come. So it's not easy for caregivers to make an after-school meeting with young children sometimes. So at times, providing childcare and maybe snacks for younger children could help. Sometimes offering 2 different times of the week for family events can allow more families to participate. Some are free in the evening, some might be free during the day. Principals who know the families in their schools can understand how to make engagements with families more accessible to them, whether it's providing childcare for younger children or sometimes offering different times of the week, right, for families to participate. And for many of our families, language can sometimes be a barrier. So is there a way to offer simultaneous interpretation at school meetings so that all parents, regardless of their English language fluency, can participate? So, these efforts allow families of all backgrounds to view their participation as meaningful and valued. And on to a third question with some framing first. So sometimes the difficulty in participating lies, let's be honest, in past negative experiences that parents or caregivers may have had, maybe as students themselves growing up in schools, or as parents who've had challenging and hurtful experiences with past teachers. At the same time, we know that teachers also have had negative experiences themselves with students' families that are kind of scarring for them and can influence how they interact with families. One of my graduate advisors, Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, writes about this in her book, The Essential Conversation, What Parents and Teachers Can Learn from Each Other, another book that I highly recommend. She talks about what she calls the ghosts of the classroom, these negative and traumatic experiences that parents and teachers carry with them, as well as the fear and distrust and anxiety and anger that accompanies those experiences. It definitely colors the interactions that they have with each other. So if I refuse to call you back when you, the teacher, leaves a message on my phone to talk about a problem regarding my child in school that day, could that refusal be colored by my past experiences with teachers? And when I don't call you back, do you, the teacher, assume that it's because I'm too busy to be involved or that I'm disinterested in my child's education because that's what you carry around in your mind based on your experiences with families? So how many times are the moments that teachers and caregivers share with each other, those formal and informal interactions, how often are they shaped by the past experiences that they carry with them? So the important question for us here, I'm finally getting to the question, is it's twofold. Is there an acknowledgement that pain and trauma can be part of parents' past and present experiences with schools? And what kinds of blind spots and biases might we carry as teachers or principals about families that are based either in our past negative experiences or even in our lack of knowledge and understanding? In essence, there are ways that trust has eroded, and so we have to find opportunities to rebuild that trust. So some of the following questions that I'm going to walk you through help us think about this trust building process. So the fourth question, when I think about my experience as a first-year teacher, there was an invaluable lesson I learned when I decided a few months in to call every one of my students' families. I went home each evening, and I did this. It was an idea that came out of just a lot of one-on-one conversations with my students. I'm not going to lie, the first few weeks of my first year of teaching were kind of rough, and I was a little haggard and just needed to be creative and think of some ideas. And one of the things that I did is I realized that these students, I was new to the school, new to teaching, they knew nothing about me. And so I felt like we needed to just get to know each other. So one of the things that I did was I had a student come in and stay in the room and have lunch with me each day. And you could, I pulled your name out of a jar. You could decide to stay and have lunch with me, or you could decide that you wanted to pass. I was always like nervous that they would always say that they wanted to just eat lunch with their friends, but 99% of the time they wanted to stay and eat with me. And it was just a chance for us to have a one-on-one and to get to know each other. So I learned about what they did on the weekend. I learned about their basketball games, their baseball games, playing catch with their cousins, their family members. And it led me with this feeling and this sense that I only knew them very partially by seeing them in the classroom. And so I wanted to know them more holistically. And so I kind of came up with this idea that every day that I had a moment in the evening, I would call someone's family. So I went home each evening with one or two students' home phone numbers. And my goal was to just call and let their parent or caregiver know about something that they'd accomplished in school that I was proud of. So maybe it was dedication to a project, showing kindness to a classmate, a memorable contribution in class, or even the courage to stand up for a friend. These moments happen all day long, and I wanted to try to remember some of them and share them with families. But what I distinctly remember about those phone calls home was the silence I always heard when the call connected and after I introduced myself as the child's teacher. Like when I say, hello, may I speak to so-and-so? This is Soo Hong, I'm Deshawn's teacher. When I went, there was always a silence. And when I went on to say that I was calling to share an affirmation or a highlight from the day, there was always this sigh of relief, because in most cases, parents expected only to hear from me if there was a problem or a concern. I still feel that way every time I get a phone call from my child's school. So the question I want us to think about is, what inspires or provokes communication between families and schools? Inspires and provokes, right? Is it problem-centered, or is it shaped by positive and affirming messages about students? And as children grow older and they enter the upper grades, do we continue to value those conversations about student success? Or do we begin to feel that conversations with families should be reserved for those whose children struggle? My daughter is in 10th grade and goes to a pretty large high school in Boston. And you only have parent-teacher conferences when your child has a certain if they're in trouble, right? So now when I ask this question, I'm not fooling myself into thinking that teachers will never have a reason to bring up a concern with a caregiver, but what's the first communication as well as continued communication? What is that like between a parent and a teacher? And are there conversations that focus on affirmation and encouragement? The fifth question we can ask is, Are there signals, symbols, and messages in the school that families matter? We know that the ways educators communicate with families influences what families think of their child's school. But we forget that what a school or teacher does in their interactions with families sends powerful messages to young people about how their school views them as well as their families, right? So principals can host informal chats over coffee with families. Teachers can find ways to incorporate family stories or oral histories into classroom learning. There can be pictures of students' families or events with families up on the walls of the school. There can be moments when students hear the ways teachers and school leaders talk about their families, when parents are invited into the classroom to share their experience in different ways, when schools host special conversations about applying to college for families of students who might be the first in their family to attend college. You know, these are some of the many ways that schools message to students. We think your family is an important part of who you are, and we want to celebrate that. This last question is an important one because often when I talk to educators, they ask me, you know, they want to hear about what I've learned in my research so that I can share the best practices that they can start implementing in their school. But, you know, as you may notice from the questions I've shared with you so far, I'm not really pushing any one program or agenda or a must-have event for families in the school. Rather, these questions ask us to explore the mindsets we have as educators towards students' families. But what's also important here is that we don't want to forget that our schools and our families and communities are unique and diverse. They come with different experiences, expectations, fears, anxieties, and contributions. So there should always be space for us to ask, what do our families want? What kinds of questions do they have for us? What kinds of concerns do they have, or what kinds of challenges are they experiencing that they want us to know about? Schools can have a plan to engage families, but are they making space for families to contribute their ideas to the plan regularly, with ease and comfort, and even accessibility and confidentiality? I have, one additional point that I want to share, and I think it's an important one that reveals some of the challenges that we as researchers have noticed when we make our observations about family engagement in schools. I know there's a range of educators here in this space, and I want to say that it's important to recognize that this call to engage families is not just a call to action for those of us who work in elementary schools or with younger children. We understand clearly that older children and adolescents have different needs and expectations when it comes to having families present in the school. As children grow older, they become more independent, and they don't always want to see their parents walking the hallways or volunteering in the classrooms. I totally understand that. I have a 10th grader. But for too long, we've interpreted this respect for an older child's independence to mean that it's less important to be connected to their family. And this couldn't be furthest from the truth. Middle and high school kids need guidance with sleep, with stress and anxiety, social media, friendships, academic experiences. They're talking about their own hopes and dreams for themselves. During this time in their life where they stretch out on their own and try to gain a sense of independence, they also need adults in their life who know them, who notice when they're shining or struggling. So teachers of middle and high school students need to find developmentally appropriate ways to connect with students' families. So the shape and substance of family engagement should change as kids become older, but the desire for authentic connection and relationships should still be there. I'm going to end with some reflections about the unusual nature of this year and some of the lessons learned as schools and families have endured the disruptions caused by this pandemic. I think that more than ever, educators have relied on families to support a child's learning this year, right? They've relied on families to have the home be a learning environment, counted on their support to help children log into their online classrooms and get them motivated to show up to school, without the physical presence of friends, watch them problem solve with children when the internet was spotty or they became upset and disengaged. And none of this has been easy for parents and caregivers, as they also manage the many responsibilities they face as caregivers to multiple children and as co-workers, partners or spouses, family members taking care of others in their lives, and the many other roles that they play. Teachers have made miraculous and heroic adjustments to thinking about classroom learning. They've shared screens, run breakout rooms, discovered online resources, wrangled webcams, comforted students who feel overwhelmed, and addressed their own fears about health and safety this year. With remote learning, teachers and families have had unprecedented access to each other. Parents at home can hear teachers teaching, and with students connecting to their classrooms from home, teachers can understand students' family lives a bit more. Younger siblings might join to play a math game, or family members can be visible in the background. In many cases, this year has increased the school's reliance on families, and we've seen more communication between families and schools than we have before, right? So while in-person meetings are always desirable when connecting with a child's family, it may have been easier to connect with families this year using Zoom or online platforms. And because teachers are more exposed to students' families due to the home becoming the learning environment, it's also led to teachers thinking more about students' lives outside of the classroom. Similarly, as parents struggle to get their children connected to the right Zoom link or help them navigate those online spaces, they may have a greater understanding of the complexity of a teacher's job. You know, I hope that this year, as disruptive and devastating as it's been, has also taught us some important lessons that we try to carry forward with us. That this need to connect and rely upon each other has always been here. That teachers and administrators can't fully support their students without the supportive partnerships with their families. And that sometimes, and for some families, finding new ways to connect through Zoom, messaging apps, and other creative platforms that we've experimented with this year can make the difference between whether a parent participates or not. In essence, this has been a year that's taught us that families and educators can truly be allies to support the academic, social, emotional development of students. And I'm just going to close with this statement on commitment and vision. A commitment to engaging families and communities has to be integrated into all aspects of a school's vision and a principal's leadership. Beyond the programs and activities, they have to be committed to interviewing for and hiring teachers who've demonstrated a disposition to do this work well and to partner with families. And there should be supports within the school, like veteran teachers and coaches, or family and community sports support staff, professional development, to guide educators as they learn to be more proficient in their work with families. And I think most importantly, we educators have to be guided with the stories and experiences of families. So I want to close with some guidance from one of the principals featured in my book, Natural Allies. And her name is Ginny Chalmers. She expressed the view that she had to model and lead with a commitment to engaging families and communities. She understands that parents and caregivers will have negative experiences in schools that shape their willingness to trust her and engage with teachers, but school leaders must model a willingness to be led by those experiences. And so I'm going to close with her words. She says, "There's something really important in being able to get to these stories and their experience, and listening to the stories and believing they can shape the direction of what you're doing at the school and how you're working with families. I think it really has to start with validating a parent's experience and then understanding just how traumatic and scary some of this can be for them. In some ways, this means we have to be slow to blame and quick to listen longer. I've had some young teachers who hear this from a parent, and their initial response to that is, "It's so disrespectful to me. I would never do that." And I have to tell them that this is not about you. It's about them and their experience in school, and they're sharing a trauma that they had in school, and it's our professional responsibility to have the courage to listen and take it in, and therefore to understand the fury that they bring to any critique that they hear of their child's experience. I just appreciate you all, inviting me to kind of share these thoughts, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Hong. It was wonderful and amazing. And that quote, slow to blame, but quick to listen longer. You shared so many powerful questions that really are going to give us an opportunity once we sit on this. And I think what the beautiful thing is we're going to go back and we're going to read and we're going to watch this video and we're going to sit on a lot of those questions and really be able to internalize and then talk with our teachers, our principals, our superintendents, whatever role we're in, and really be very reflective in some of the questions that you asked. One of them you said, are our educational activities or events providing space for families to get to know one another and then build relationships with each other? Another one was, what are the values and beliefs that we hold about our students and our families? So you're really causing us, these questions are going to cause us to really look inward and reflect on who we are individually, and then how we in our roles can really help to bring this inclusiveness and equity in education in our roles in our schools. So thank you so very much. I want to go to the chat room here, and anyone has a question, and we'd like for you to put it in the chat room. Someone says communication is important. However, two-way communication is building for all parties. And you talked about relationships. One way is a transactional relationship. So I love that quote. Here's a question from Ms. Smith. How can we get access to the 5 questions from your presentation? Do you have those listed somewhere?
Well, I can share them in a document. Maybe after the presentation, I can just, put them together and email it to you, Michelle.
Great,
yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else have any other questions you would like to put in the chat room? I'm gonna ask you a question. So we have on our line, we have some principals, we have assistant principals, we have teachers, specialists, superintendents. After hearing your presentation today, if they wanted to start tomorrow in their schools, what's one thing that you would have them do, or the first thing you think they should do after sharing the information that you shared today? What would you ask them to do tomorrow if they wanted to make change?
Well, if you wanted to make change and I think one of the first ways that you could start is to just have these conversations, right? So I think if you were to start tomorrow and you were interested in kind of building better connections with families at your school, maybe you could get together with some of the other teachers at your school and just have a conversation and talk about, like, what are some of the experiences that and interactions that you're having with families, and how, what do you think are some of the challenges that you're facing sometimes when you're communicating with families? What kinds of support would you need? And I think just even being able to have a conversation about if this is something that we're not doing well or we're not doing a lot of, asking the question why, right? And I think sometimes even sharing our own experiences as parents and as caregivers is one way to kind of get into the conversation, because we often, we don't often consider that we play multiple roles. We have intersectional identities, right? I'm a daughter, and I'm a mother, and I'm a friend who has I'm a and a godmother and an aunt, and we have all these different roles and identities. And I think sometimes we kind of have to allow ourselves, when we're starting to have this conversation, kind of have to allow ourselves to think about just generally the relationship between schools and families and what that means to us, right? So, I feel like if you were interested in this work, then it's important to find some thought partners and some people who can kind of help you have this conversation. And then I think, when you're ready and when you have a mindset that allows you, that really where you want to strive to have these kind of relational connections with families, I think then thinking about how do I have some of these conversations then? like that way that I shared earlier, my first year of teaching, it was something that I continued to do throughout my time as a teacher, just like being able to call someone and introduce myself and share something that their child went through that I felt really proud of them for, and that I want to call you and I want to share this with you because I'm not sure if he told you about this today. And then just being able to kind of hold space with a parent to like kind of dwell in that moment about, what we really love and appreciate about this child. Those conversations often led to kind of, a little bit of laughter, a little sense of connection. It allowed us opportunities to kind of connect as people, right? Like instead of just like the formal connection that, yes, I am your child's 5th grade teacher, but more like, we go to the same grocery store, or you just live a mile from my house, or I grew up in that neighborhood, those kinds of things. And I think like just being able to, I think one of the things that I didn't talk about in the talk, which I think is really important, is that like the whole point about having these authentic relationships, like one of the goals is that like we want to see each other as human beings, right? Like it's not just about, getting to know a parent so that they can kind of help support your agenda, but it's about, trying to have a humanizing touch to your work as a teacher. And part of that means that you want to connect with families, as individuals and as human beings that kind of have this like shared love and support for this young person.
And speaking about that, and that sort of really, Miss Jones quote commented on this, and like to say, it says, I appreciate your acknowledgement of the trauma many of our parents endure. Oftentimes, they are products of school systems that neglected their educational experience, and there are very real barriers and fears between the parent and the school system due to their own K-12 experience. And you talked a lot about that. You want to expand on that a little bit, because that has to do with the mindset as well.
Yeah, I think this is something that a lot of, it may be especially new teachers, but not exclusively. I think a lot of educators don't really think about this because a lot of educators are not parents themselves, right? They're young, they're young adults. And I think that one of the things that I've heard from parents across the different research projects that I've been involved in is this common theme that like, in some ways, like if I'm resisting the appeals or calls of a teacher, it's because I've had so many bad experiences. Like I don't want to pick up the phone because I don't want to fight with them. Or if I do, like if a teacher tells me that my child did something in school today, I have parents who've told me I'm not going to trust them. I'm not going to believe that this is right. And so like if I push back, it's because I'm advocating for my child, because I've seen situations before where she's been misunderstood or misrepresented, and I'm not going to let that happen again. And so, sometimes like we kind of educators can take those moments and think, why are they so angry at me? Like, why are they so aggressive and confrontational? And it's because they have a failure to understand that like that is an act of love.
Absolutely.
It's not an act, it's not being angry or aggressive to you. And it's kind of takes me back to Ginny's words, like it's literally not about you, right? So it's not about like being angry towards you. It's like, it's about them protecting their child and advocating for their child because they don't trust that, they don't trust your intentions,
right? Because
they don't know who you are. And so sometimes like, teachers will get upset about that and say, well, I didn't do anything to deserve that kind of that distrust. And clearly you may not have, but that doesn't change the situation that you have work to do, right? That you have, this is where this parent is. You can choose to ignore it and kind of steamroll in with your own beliefs and kind of your own agenda. Or if you really want to make a connection to this family, then you have to start thinking about, the possibility that there are experiences that they hold that, that are not positive and that are traumatic, right? And so I think that being able to allow educators to understand this, because I think that they don't often get to the point where they understand the issue, because if a parent is like hostile or refuses to call you back, you just write them off. So you're not really like, no, and no one's like trying to talk to you about why that might be occurring. And so I think it's, it's irresponsible for us as teacher educators and as, people who prepare principals and school leaders to not allow our, educators in training to understand that this is a very real possibility for families.
Thank you. Well, when you talk about building trust and how important trust is to our families, Mr. Evans asked this question. He says, how well did the families receive your dialogue regarding conversations about getting to know the families better? So can you kind of share a little bit with us about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was probably the most transformational thing that I did as a teacher, and for myself as well as for the family. So, as long as I wasn't like catching someone at a bad time, right? And they had a moment, even if it was just like a few minutes, like I think, those initial conversations that I had with families allowed us to just connect about the child that they love and want to support. And I think it was so apparent to me as a new teacher. It made me sad because every single conversation transpired exactly the same way. They were shocked that I was calling to tell them something good about their child. And if I thought back on my own experience, I don't remember very many conversations that there were no phone calls home to my parents. I think in part because they assumed that they didn't speak English, but also I was not a kid who got in trouble a lot, right? And so I thought back on my experience and thought there were no conversations or phone calls home to my family either. And, and it saddened me, but I think that was an important realization that I had a responsibility to connect with families in a way that was different. You could say that if a parent has had multiple years of painful experiences with their child's teacher and struggles regularly, you would think that they would be so hardened and distrustful that they would never give me a chance. But that was never true. Every conversation I had with a parent, even when they kind of got to the point where they said, I've never been able to talk to my kid's teacher like this before, or no one's ever called to tell me anything that she's done, in a positive light. And when you learn about kind of the expectation that the interaction with the school is going to be a negative one, you would think that it makes you hold a grudge and that it would be so much harder for me to kind of break in and be able to have that kind of connection with them. But that was never true. So I think one of the things that's so meaningful about these authentic relationships is that parents have a capacity to be very forgiving and show grace.
Yeah.
When it comes to building new relationships with teachers, when you show that you care about their child and when you show that you want to be in a relationship with them. And I always felt like that was one of the most powerful things I learned about families, is that even though I'm inexperienced, they have grace towards me. Even though they've had bad experiences with their child's teacher in the past, they can trust that I'm not going to be that way, or we can trust that we can have a conversation and work it out. And to me as a young teacher, that meant a lot. And it was I think it was one of the most transformational elements of my teaching practice.
Well, we thank you, Dr. Hong. Your words have been transformational, and we look forward to hopefully one day again having you come back and share some more nuggets of wisdom and insight and research, and really just giving us a lot to think about as we move forward as educators, as leaders, as superintendents, as Virginia State University. We thank you for spending your evening with us and look forward to your return. I will turn it over now to Dr. Walter to say some closing remarks. So thank you all so much.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. If we don't get anything else out of this conversation, I hope many of our teachers, administrators, and others uh, have a better understanding of what true engagement really is, what real relationship building needs to occur. If we really want to see a difference in our students, so often we think we are being engaging when truly we are being just transactional. We're just getting information or collecting information. And I think when we really look at what so many of our schools do on a regular basis, it's really acting as if our students are just consumers at the checkout line. And we are just collecting their money and asking them to keep it moving and giving them some groceries, as opposed to really understanding what those individuals need, what we can build around in order to help them make the kind of schematic understandings of what is being taught, and to really understand them as people and really, as you said, see them. So often we don't. And I hope from this conversation and some of the others that we start to have those kind of real conversations in our community so that we can really start to see children, really start to embrace their families, not just tolerate them. And as I think some of the comments said, when so many of our students have had these ill effects from school, and or the parents have had these problems in schools, and now their children are reliving some of those same issues, we are only building on a faulty foundation. And so we have to shore up the foundation first, get people to actually see one another, and then we can really build towards understanding and helping other students really get to where they're trying to go from an academic standpoint. I thank you so much, Dr. Hong, for the conversation and everything that you shared with everyone. I'm really excited about the conversations that will happen after this. Is Dr. Norman on?
He is not on, so you're going to finish it out, and we're going to send everyone to a breakout room. So you are the finale.
Well, I pretty much have covered it. I think when you start talking about going to those breakout rooms and having those truthful, real conversations, whereas each and every one of you, I think, have probably had similar experiences as Dr. Hong has shared. Now it's talking about what do we do next? How do we really build those relationships and make sure that we're not just passing over and looking through children and their families?